There was a man named Jack who had always been a deep thinker. He was constantly pondering the mysteries of the universe and the meaning of life, but the more he thought, the more he felt trapped inside his own mind. As the years passed, Jack became more and more reclusive, withdrawing from the world around him and spending all his time lost in thought. But the more he thought, the darker his thoughts became. One night, as he lay in bed, he felt a presence in the room with him. He sat up and saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly fingers that seemed to reach out towards him. Jack was terrified, but he couldn't move. The figure whispered to him, its voice low and raspy, telling him that he was trapped in his own mind and that there was no escape. From that night on, Jack felt haunted by the figure. It appeared to him in his dreams, tormenting him with its whispers and its cold, bony fingers. He tried to ignore it, but it seemed to be getting stronger, more persistent. As time went on, Jack's mental state began to deteriorate. He was plagued by nightmares and terrifying hallucinations. He could no longer distinguish between reality and the twisted world of his own mind. One day, Jack's family found him dead in his room. It was ruled as suicide, but the truth was far more sinister. Jack had been driven to the brink of insanity by the figure that haunted him, trapped in the confines of his own mind with no escape. And so, the figure continued to lurk in the shadows, waiting for its next victim to become trapped in the prison of their own thoughts. There was a woman named Emily who always felt like something was off. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she had this nagging feeling that she wasn't entirely in control of her own mind. It started out small, with just a few strange dreams that she couldn't quite remember. But as time went on, Emily began to experience more and more disturbing occurrences. She would wake up in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, feeling like something was watching her. She started to hear strange whispers in her head, telling her to do things that she knew were wrong. One night, as Emily lay in bed, she saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly fingers that seemed to reach out towards her. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure spoke to her in a voice that was not quite human, telling her that it was from another realm and that it had chosen her to be its vessel. Emily was horrified, but she couldn't resist the creature's control over her mind. As the days went by, Emily's behavior became more erratic. She would have outbursts of anger or sadness for no apparent reason. She would go for long periods of time without eating or sleeping, lost in the twisted world of her own mind. Eventually, Emily's friends and family became worried about her. They tried to reach out to her, but she was distant and unresponsive. They knew something was wrong, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. One day, Emily disappeared without a trace. Her family and friends searched for her, but she was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Years went by, and people began to forget about Emily. But in the shadows, the shadowy figure continued to lurk, waiting for its next victim to become a vessel for its otherworldly powers. There was a small town that was known for its dark history. The town was built on the ruins of an ancient civilization, and many believed that the spirits of the dead still roamed the area. The townspeople did their best to ignore the rumors, but they couldn't deny the strange occurrences that seemed to happen all too frequently. One day, a group of teenagers decided to explore the ruins of an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The house had been abandoned for years, and many believed it was cursed. But the teenagers were young and fearless, and they didn't believe in curses or ghosts. As they made their way through the old house, they started to feel uneasy. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. Suddenly, They heard a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows. The teenagers froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. They looked around, but they couldn't see anything. Then, out of the darkness, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared. The eyes seemed to follow them as they ran through the house, trying to escape the unseen creature. But the creature was too fast, too powerful. It hunted them through the shadows, its growls getting closer and closer. They could feel its hot breath on the back of their necks as they stumbled and fell, desperately trying to find a way out. In the end, only one of the teenagers made it out alive. He never spoke of what he saw in the darkness of that old house, but his eyes held a haunted look that never quite went away. And the town continued to whisper about the curse that had claimed the lives of so many over the years, a curse that they knew deep down they could never escape. Sophie had been on Tinder for months, swiping left and right in search of her perfect match. She had almost given up hope when she came across Mark's profile. He seemed like the perfect guy, tall, handsome, and with a charming smile that made her heart skip a beat. They exchanged messages for a few days and agreed to meet for a date at a local coffee shop. Sophie was nervous, but excited. She had a good feeling about Mark. When she arrived at the coffee shop, Mark was already there, sitting at a table in the corner. He smiled and stood up when he saw her, and Sophie felt her nerves ease a bit. The date started off well. They talked about their interests, their jobs, and their families. Sophie felt like she had finally found someone she could connect with. But as the night wore on, Mark started to act strangely. He kept staring at her with a cold, dead look in his eyes. He stopped smiling and became quiet, his body tense. Sophie tried to make small talk, but Mark didn't seem interested in anything she had to say. Then, out of nowhere, Mark reached across the table and grabbed her wrist. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into her skin. Sophie tried to pull away, but he wouldn't let go. "Let's go back to my place," he said, his voice low and menacing. Sophie's heart raced. She tried to shake off his grip, but he was too strong. She realized too late that she had made a grave mistake by coming here alone with a stranger. Mark led her out of the coffee shop and into his car. The ride was silent, except for the sound of Sophie's rapid breathing. She tried to calm herself down, to think of a way to escape, but her mind was blank. When they arrived at Mark's house, he dragged her inside and locked the door. Sophie felt like she was in a nightmare. She tried to run, but Mark was too fast. He tackled her to the ground and held her there, his eyes cold and lifeless. Sophie knew then that she was going to die. She screamed for help, but no one came. Mark had planned this all along, and now he was going to make her pay for his twisted desires. Sophie closed her eyes, waiting for the end. But then, she heard a noise outside the window. It was the sound of breaking glass, followed by a loud shout. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a group of police officers rushed in. Mark was arrested, and Sophie was rescued. It took her years to recover from the trauma of that night, but she never forgot the hero who had saved her life. And she never went on another Tinder date again. It was a dark and stormy night when Emily was walking home from work. As she walked through the dimly lit alleyway, she heard something that caught her attention. It was a faint cry that seemed to be coming from inside a nearby dumpster. Emily's heart raced as she hesitantly approached the dumpster. When she opened the lid, she found something that would haunt her for the rest of her life, a newborn baby, wrapped in a dirty blanket, left to die in the cold, damp alleyway. Without hesitation, Emily picked up the baby and ran back to her apartment. She knew she had to call the police. but she couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt for leaving the baby alone for even a few moments. As she waited for the police to arrive, she tried to comfort the crying baby as best she could. When the police arrived, Emily handed the baby over to them, hoping that it would be taken to a safe place where it could be cared for properly. However, as she watched them take the baby away, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The following night, Emily heard a faint scratching sound coming from her front door. When she opened it, she found a note that read, "You shouldn't have taken what wasn't yours." Emily's heart raced as she looked around, but there was no one in sight. She closed the door and locked it, but the scratching sounds continued, growing louder and more persistent. Emily tried to ignore it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. Days turned into weeks, and Emily's life became a living nightmare. She was constantly followed by an eerie feeling of being watched, and strange things began to happen around her apartment. Objects would move on their own, and doors would open and close inexplicably. She couldn't escape the feeling that the baby she had found was somehow still with her, haunting her every move. One night, as Emily was lying in bed, she felt something cold and clammy touch her cheek. When she opened her eyes, she saw the ghostly figure of a baby standing beside her bed, staring at her with empty, soulless eyes. From that night on, Emily was never the same. She was haunted by the ghostly presence of the baby she had found, and she knew that she would never find peace until she could lay the baby's spirit to rest. It was a dark and stormy night, and Emma was driving home alone after a late shift at work. She was tired and just wanted to get home to her warm bed, but as she drove down the desolate country road, she noticed a figure walking in the middle of the road ahead. Emma slowed down and tried to swerve around the person, but they suddenly jumped in front of her car. Emma slammed on the brakes, and the figure disappeared into the night. Shaken but relieved that she hadn't hit someone, Emma got out of her car to check if the person was okay. But as she looked around, she realized that there was no one there. No sign of the figure she had just seen. Feeling unnerved, Emma quickly got back in her car and continued driving. But as she drove, she felt like someone was watching her. Every time she looked in her rearview mirror, she saw nothing but darkness. Suddenly, a loud banging noise came from the trunk of her car. Emma pulled over and got out to investigate, but when she opened the trunk, she found nothing out of the ordinary. She shook her head, thinking she was just being paranoid, and got back in her car. But as she drove away, the banging noise started again, louder this time. Emma panicked and drove to the nearest police station. When she arrived, the officers searched her car and found a man hiding in the back seat, holding a knife. Emma had unknowingly picked up a hitchhiker who had planned to harm her. Shaken and traumatized, Emma realized that the figure she had seen earlier had been a warning that had saved her life. Mary had always been afraid of the dark. Even as a child, she never wanted to be left alone in a dark room or hallway. As an adult, she made sure to always have a nightlight in her bedroom, even though she felt silly about it. One night, Mary's power went out during a storm. She fumbled for her phone, trying to use the flashlight app to guide her through the darkness. She made her way to the bathroom, but as she turned on the faucet to wash her hands, she heard a faint whispering sound. At first, she thought it was just the wind howling outside, but the sound grew louder and more distinct. It sounded like a voice, but she couldn't make out what it was saying. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and the room fell completely silent. Mary felt like something was watching her, and she quickly splashed water on her face and left the bathroom. As she walked down the hallway, she saw a figure standing at the end of it. It was a tall, dark figure, with long arms and legs that seemed to stretch out impossibly far. Mary froze in terror, unable to move or scream. The figure started moving towards her, slowly but deliberately, and Mary could feel its cold breath on her neck. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure was getting closer and closer, and Mary knew she was about to be consumed by its darkness. Suddenly, the power came back on, and Mary found herself alone in the hallway. She breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it had all been her imagination. But as she turned to go back to her bedroom, she saw a pair of glowing eyes in the darkness, and she knew that the darkness had never truly left her. Samantha had always been a thrill seeker. She loved pushing herself to the limit, whether it was bungee jumping off a bridge or skydiving from a plane. So when she decided to go scuba diving in the Great Barrier Reef, she thought it would be just another exciting adventure. But things quickly went wrong. She was diving with a group, but they became separated in the murky water. Suddenly, she felt something wrap around her leg. She tried to kick it off, but it wouldn't budge. Panicking, she looked down and saw a giant octopus clinging to her. Samantha tried to swim away, but the octopus held on tight, its tentacles squeezing her leg with unbelievable force. She tried to fight back, but the creature was too strong. As she struggled, she felt herself growing weaker and weaker, her breaths becoming shallower and shallower. Just as she was about to lose consciousness, she saw a flash of light. It was a rescue diver, coming to her aid. But as the diver got closer, Samantha realized that it wasn't a human at all. It was some kind of underwater creature, with jagged teeth and glowing eyes. The creature grabbed Samantha and dragged her deeper into the water, away from the safety of the surface. Samantha tried to scream, but water filled her lungs. She felt her body growing colder and more numb, and she knew that this was it. She was going to die. But then, she felt a sudden burst of warmth. She opened her eyes and saw that she was floating in a bright, peaceful place. She realized that she was no longer in the ocean, but somewhere else entirely. The voice spoke to her, telling her that she had been given a second chance at life, but that she would never forget what she had seen. Samantha woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by concerned friends and family. She tried to tell them about the creature that had attacked her, but they dismissed it as a hallucination. Samantha knew the truth, though. She had faced a horror beyond her wildest nightmares, and she would never forget it. The old mansion at the end of the street had always been rumored to be haunted. People would whisper about strange noises coming from the house at night and eerie lights flickering in the windows, but no one had ever dared to venture inside. One day, a group of friends decided to explore the mansion. They were skeptics, convinced that the rumors were just a myth. They entered through a broken window and started to explore the dusty old rooms. As they climbed the stairs to the second floor, they heard a faint whispering sound. At first, they dismissed it as just their imagination. But as they got closer to the source of the sound, the whispers grew louder and more distinct. They followed the sound to a locked door. One of the friends pulled out a set of lockpicks and managed to open the door. As they stepped inside, they found themselves in a room filled with old dolls. The dolls seemed to be watching them with lifeless eyes, and their clothes and hair were tangled and filthy. But there was one doll that stood out from the rest. It was a porcelain doll with curly blonde hair and a lace dress. It looked almost human. As they approached the doll, they heard a faint giggling sound. Suddenly, the doll's head turned to face them, and it spoke in a soft, eerie voice. "Thank you for coming to play with me," it said. The friends were paralyzed with fear. They tried to leave the room, but the door wouldn't budge. The doll's eyes followed them as they frantically searched for a way out. Then, they heard a creaking sound. The floorboards beneath them began to shift and crack. They realized too late that they were standing on a trapdoor, and it was about to give way. With a loud crash, the floor collapsed beneath them, and they fell into a dark, dusty basement. As they struggled to their feet, they realized that they were not alone. The dolls from the room above had followed them, and they were now crawling towards them with twisted, demonic expressions on their faces. The friends screamed as the dolls closed in around them, their fingers clawing at their flesh. They were trapped, with no way out. The mansion had claimed its newest victims, and they would never be seen again. Martha loved collecting dolls, but her favorite doll was a vintage porcelain doll that she had found at an antique shop. She had named the doll Alice and would spend hours talking to it and brushing its long, curly hair. But little did Martha know that Alice was haunted by a vengeful spirit. One night, Martha woke up to the sound of her bedroom door creaking open. She sat up in bed, expecting to see a cat, but instead, she saw Alice standing at the foot of her bed. Martha was confused. She knew she had put the doll away in her toy chest before going to sleep. As Martha reached out to grab Alice, the doll suddenly lunged forward and sunk its teeth into her hand. Martha screamed and pulled her hand away, but the doll wouldn't let go. Martha tried to shake the doll off, but it just clung on tighter and tighter. Finally, Martha managed to free herself and threw the doll across the room. As soon as Alice hit the wall, Martha heard a blood-curdling scream that echoed throughout the room. She turned on the lights, but the doll was nowhere to be seen. From that night on, Martha would often hear strange noises in her bedroom at night. Footsteps, whispers, and the sound of something scratching at the walls. And whenever she tried to sleep, she could feel a cold presence looming over her, watching her every move. One day, Martha decided enough was enough and went back to the antique shop where she had bought Alice. She asked the shopkeeper about the doll and learned that it had belonged to a young girl who had died under mysterious circumstances. From then on, Martha got rid of all her dolls and never collected them again. But she still heard the whispers and felt the cold presence in her room every night, a constant reminder of the haunted doll that had terrorized her.